Hey there, it's Johny-J here and welcome to another episode of the 3C Show. And as always, I am super pumped to be here. And today on the show, we're talking about the age-old question, JPEG versus RAW. And you know what I mean, man? It's something that gets talked about a lot. And you know, for landscape and nature photographers, there's actually reasons to use both. And I'm gonna get into those straight after this intro. Actually, I don't have an intro, so welcome to the 3C Show. Awesome. All right. So, first things first, what are the different formats? How do they differ, okay? So, you've got your RAW format, and you might see them on a Sony, it's like a .AWR, on a Nikon, it's .NEF, Canon, I can't remember. Adobe even have their own RAW format, it's called a .DNG, a .negative file. So basically what that is, it's an uncompressed file, okay? Which means that whatever camera you've taken that photograph on, it's that image, that file is displaying all the data that that camera sensor could capture, okay? And that's the important thing to know. It's got all the information, absolutely everything. Whatever that sensor can capture, it's pushed down into that file and it's all there for you to play with in your post-production, okay? So what is a JPEG file then? What differs from a JPEG? So a JPEG file has got certain parts or certain tones of the image stripped out of it, okay? They're a smaller file, so they aren't as big in file size, but what happens with a JPEG file is the camera gets to make some of those creative choices around sharpening, around saturation, contrast. Now you do have some creative control in camera with picture profiles and creative styles and things like that, but honestly you end up with a file that does not have the same amount of information for you to use in your post-processing and to make those awesome adjustments and to really bring out the creativity of your photography as a RAW file does, okay? So that's the difference. So the JPEG file is a compressed file, where the RAW file is the uncompressed, it's got all the information. That's the main two things you need to know. So 99% of the time we're going to be shooting in a RAW format, you know, for our landscape and nature photography. And the reason is we're dealing with situations where the dynamic range, meaning the difference between the highlights and the shadows, is absolutely extreme. You know, times when you're shooting into the sun, times where you've got that massive dynamic range that you're dealing with. You want to have as much information in your file as possible, because often, you know, we even have to do things like bracketing and merging images in HDR with different exposures. And the reason is our cameras just can't capture all of that. So from the get-go, you want to have as much information as possible to be able to correct your exposure in post. So that's why it's really important to shoot with RAW. Now, I would say there's probably one occasion when, I would say there's two occasions when I would shoot JPEG, okay? The first, you'll notice whenever you're shooting continuous with your camera, so say you're shooting wildlife or anything fast moving, you'll notice if you've got it set to RAW file, what will happen is you'll push down the shutter button and your camera will go and all in a few frames later it'll go juk, juk, juk. And that's because you've hit the buffer, okay? Your camera can't write any more images faster than what it currently can do, you know, so it just slows right down. But if you set your camera to straight JPEG, what will happen is you'll find it'll go and it'll keep going, and then all of a sudden you'll hear juk, juk, juk. And the reason is, what happens is it hits the buffer later because the files are so much smaller, your camera can write them to that card a whole lot quicker. So there are times when you may want to set it to straight JPEG, okay? And it's very rare, but honestly, there are times, but you just got to make sure that if you ever set your camera to JPEG, make sure you're absolutely nailing everything in camera, okay? Your exposure and your white balance, you want to get all that right, because you've got to remember with your JPEG file, you don't have as much room to play with, okay? In your final image for your post-processing, okay? So that's probably the only time I'd ever shoot JPEG. And the last time I would shoot it, okay? And this is what I recommend you do if you're learning to post-process and you're still not 100% sure how to process your images, you're still learning, but you want to get out there, you want to share some images straight to the web, straight to social media without having to do, you know, your post-processing, then I recommend you shoot RAW and JPEG. And what your camera will do, it will write a JPEG file and a RAW file. So it'll give you that JPEG file to share on social media, which I've often done before too, if I want to share something, you know, by Bluetooth to my phone and put it up on Facebook or Instagram or something like that. And what it'll give you the ability to do is you'll still have that RAW file. So as your post-processing skills develop, you know, you can go back to RAW files you shot previously and process them, and you'll have that file with all that information. Now, you may be thinking, yeah, but what about the storage situation? Yeah, you're right. You know, shooting just RAW and JPEG, it means you've got to store more files. But honestly, storage is so cheap these days. It's you know, it's not even an issue anymore. It's so cheap. If you can afford to buy a camera and a lens, you can afford to get yourself a couple of hard drives to back things up onto. And things like Backblaze, you know, $5 a month, they'll back up everything on your computer offsite as well. So storage really isn't an issue in this day and age. It's so cheap, okay? So I just wanted to quickly show you the difference between a RAW file and a JPEG in post on the screen here. So let's jump into this now. And you'll see what we've got here is a sunset shot, okay? And the first image here, and what I'm gonna do is I'll just reset this and I'm gonna zoom into this rock here. And you can see we've lost a bit of information here. We've got these really dark rocks and these really bright highlights here. So if I was to pull down those highlights and recover that detail and open up those shadows a bit and recover a bit of detail on the rocks, you can see that looks pretty good. So there's the before, after. Now, if I was to jump over to the JPEG version and zoom in there, and I'm just gonna reset that, and I was to pull down those highlights there and open up those shadows, you can see it's okay, but we've got this really weird banding effect here. And look, you know, we go back over here, you can see we've got information back in the, you know, lost information in these clouds, and we go back over here and we've recovered a lot of the information around that area. And that's a classic example of shooting something that's a high dynamic range where without a RAW file, you couldn't pull back any of that information. Once something is blown out, you know, big time in a JPEG, you'll never bring back that information. It's gone, you know. At least with a RAW file, I've got a chance to bring back some of that information and open up those shadows and see a bit of detail in there as well on those rocks. So that's it, that's the reason. So remember, you know, if you're unsure, shoot RAW and JPEG fine is always really good. That means it's the highest resolution JPEG your camera can produce, and at least that'll get you started with something to share, and you can go back, you know, later on and post-process those RAW files in the future when your post-processing skills get a lot better. But man, if you're not interested in keeping those JPEGs, just set it to RAW, you know. Honestly, it's a bit of a no-brainer these days. No matter what you do, you want to have the RAW file, except maybe that one instance where I said you're shooting, you know, multiple frames like wildlife or birds where they're moving really quick and you need that constant burst so you can hit that peak action and not miss it. But even then, you know, man, honestly, there's probably, you know, I can count a handful of times, you know, maybe 4 or 5 times where I've ever even thought about doing that. And that was with some of my older camera hardware that was a lot slower, okay? These days, even some of the lower end cameras get quite fast frames per second. And if you know when to hit that burst, you'll get away with shooting RAW. But there is occasions when, you know, if you've got an older camera or something like that, that you are gonna need that. So that's it, RAW versus JPEG, man. Landscape and nature photographers, man, we love our RAW. I shoot RAW. Like Jared Pollan says, Fronos, I shoot RAW. I really want to get one of those shirts. He's pretty funny, that dude. Anyway, that's it, RAW versus JPEG. I hope you like this one. Remember, if you're loving my channel, man, hit the subscribe button, hit that bell, give me a thumbs up and leave a comment, and I would love to hear from you. And remember, stay awesome, stay inspired, and I'll talk to you again really soon. All right, I'm out. Peace.